Hi, my name is Stephanie Monroy, and today my audience is my friend Andy and my mom and my brother. So music is just much more than just sound. It's a mirror to society. From disco lights to punk guitars, every decade tells a story about who we were and what we believed in, and how we changed. The 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s were much more than just eras of hit songs. They were turning points that redefined how Americans express identity, rebellion, and unity. Today, I'd like to inform you about how the music of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s shaped American culture and reflected the pulse of its people. As a student who really likes culture and music, I've explored how these decades revolutionized art and identity in America through credible sources such as documentaries such as CNN's The 1970s and Encyclopedia Britannica, to small publications from authors of music independence. And even if you weren't alive during these decades, you felt their influence in songs you listen to today, and such as and even fashion that resurfaces in artists who are still so prevalent in these movements today. I'll begin with the revolutionary sound of the 1970s, then I'll discuss the image-driven innovation of the 1980s, and finally explore the authentic and diverse expressions of the 1990s. So the 1970s were built on rebellion, rhythm, and reinvention. The 1970s were some of the most transformative decades in human history, and even more in American music, introducing genres like funk, disco, punk, rock. According to 1970s CNN's documentary, The 70s, What's Going On, released in 2015, artists like Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye brought social activism to the mainstream. Their music asked big questions about war, poverty, and justice, making soul and R&B a platform for empathy and awareness. Meanwhile, disco dominated the dance floors, led by icons such as Donna Summers and the Bee Gees. As per Encyclopedia Britannica, disco wasn't just about glitter and nightlife in big pants. It represented freedom of marginalized groups, especially LGBTQ communities and Black communities who were in such corners, pushed into corners at the time. Rock also hit new heights, like with bands like Led Zeppelin and Fleetwood Mac, defining the sounds of the decade. Not everyone embraced mainstream rock and disco though. Punk rock emerged as gritty and rebellious response, led by bands in New York such as the Ramones, or bands all across the pond in London such as the Sex Pistols, according to the documentary The 70s, released in 2015 by CNN. And funk movements such as Parliament Funkadelic and Earth, Wind & Fire brought rhythm, dance, and swagger to new levels, laying the groundwork for future hip-hop artists and R&B as stated by Encyclopedia Britannica. By the end of the 1970s, music had become both protest and escape. By the 1980s, music underwent a huge transformation that went beyond sound. It became visual, technological, and global. The 1980s, another insane decade, built on technology, image, and pop power. The 1980s completely changed how Americans listen to music. It innovated a new type of experience, because now there was a thing called MTV. The rise of MTV in 1981 made image just as important as sound. According to Smithsonian's magazine and published in 2023, MTV turned artists into visual icons. Music wasn't just heard now, it was seen on new levels. Michael Jackson's moonwalks, Madonna's voguing and daring styles weren't simply performances anymore. They were cultural movements seen by everyone that defined an entire generation. Michael Jackson's Thriller remains one of the most influential albums in history. It blurred the lines between pop, R&B, filming, and proved that music videos could be art. Technology also revolutionized how music was made. Synthesizers, drum machines, and electronic recording changed sound forever. Producers like Quincy Jones pioneered methods that shaped modern pop and R&B as stated by Encyclopedia Britannica. Arena rock flourished, it came to new heights. Bands like Van Halen and Bon Jovi filled stadiums, combining guitar-driven with mass appeal. And the 1980s were bold, they were flashy, they were futuristic, they brought hope. It was a decade that proved music could not just sell, but it could sell a sound, but also an entire identity. But after this big decade of production and visual perfection, the next decade was sick of it. They wanted something raw, real, and relatable. The 1990s was built on diversity, authenticity, and cultural fusion. The 1990s brought music back into its emotional roots. Sick of the polish, it was a decade of realness. Grunge emerged, exploded in areas like Seattle. Alternative rock emerged as well as reaction to the glossy excess of the 1980s. According to Rolling Stone mag in 2019, bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Green Day captured the frustration and honesty of the new generation. They stripped down the sound and focused on emotion over image. At the same time, hip-hop was exploding in places like LA and New York. It grew into a dominant and political force. Time magazine in 2015 calls hip-hop the biggest revolution in American music. Artists like Tupac Shakur, Lauryn Hill used the lyrics to speak truth, resistance, and pride, shaping the national dialogue. The 1990s were also a breakthrough for women. Bands like Hole, artists like Mariah Carey, they were unapologetic, they were vulnerable, they were expressive. They blended so many sounds like rock, pop stardom, especially Mariah Carey, pop stardom, R&B, and gospel to become some of the most influential women in music. The 1990s were a decade of fusion where everyone borrowed from one another. Authenticity became the new rebellion. So together, these 3 decades not only revolutionized each decade, they revolutionized music, but they became the evolution of identity itself. From the soulful activism of the 1970s to the electronic spectacle of the 1980s, and the emotional honesty and diversity and realness of the 1990s, each decade transformed the sound and culture of America. Music didn't just become the time, it changed the times, it defined the times. It became a living record of who we were and what we believed in. So next time you hear these songs, think about the emotional power that comes with it. It's not just nostalgia, it's a reminder of what the people felt at the time and what they carried with them. It will always define what it means to be human. Thank you. My audience,